With all of the recent talk of Americans, Canadians, and others looking to emigrate, move abroad around the world, and take advantage of lower cost of living, different political situations, and so forth, a lot of my viewers are rightfully concerned that this may be causing gentrification, for one thing, a raising cost of rents, Airbnbs, food costs, and so forth around the world, and causing potentially real damage. Now, is this a real concern? Is this something we should be considering when we're looking at moving abroad and so forth? I think it is certainly worth considering, and I really appreciate people who look at this and are concerned about how we can be good expats and actually do positive results for the places we're moving to rather than potentially causing damage. So let's talk about that on today's show. Now, some of these topics we've covered on other shows. Gentrification specifically, we've talked about a bit. That is a real fear to some degree. However, it is important to note, and you can go watch our episodes on that, that it is primarily an Americanism to be concerned about gentrification. Gentrification in general is just another term for urban renewal, and it is actually a very good thing. The last thing we would want to do is on its own isolate and avoid gentrification. That's not actually a good result. You need to have gentrification to be able to enable poor communities to become more affluent. It's a really critical component of social mobility. So we don't want to cut it off. That is something that happens in America, and it is a form of social engineering to try to keep the poor poor and to isolate generational wealth in richer communities. Of course, I understand that that is not what people are thinking when they want to avoid gentrification, but gentrification is a much deeper topic, but it's most important to understand that the fear of gentrification is purely American. It's a genuine fear, but the way that the world views it is not the way the United States views it. And when people say, well, we're worried about gentrifying in your country, what people hear is, we're worried about you having upward mobility and helping raise your poor out of abject poverty. It's not a good thing. So in general, if you're looking at other countries and you're worried about gentrification on its own, no, that's not a bad thing. Just don't worry about that at all. In the United States, it's a slightly different how it works, and there's different aspects of the way that zoning works and things that make gentrification more of a problem. And you can primarily the mechanism that causes problems in the United States is this taxation of perceived value. And so with gentrification, you can have people who've lived in a community and lose the ability to continue living there. That is not how gentrification works in most of the world. There's protections against that. Very, very strong protections against that. So you don't have to worry about those kinds of things the way that you do in the United States. That is the heavy taxation system in the U.S. rearing its ugly head in a way that people are struggling to perceive as taxation and instead perceive it as this bad aspect of poverty being eliminated in an area, which of course on its own is a very good thing. So we shouldn't be worried about that generally, but it's good that we're thinking about these things, of course, because we want to make sure that we're doing good wherever we go. We want to have a positive impact. So let's talk about the positive or negative impacts of over-tourism. We all hear about this, and we're aware that with Americans moving abroad in such large numbers, even before the new mass immigration, in general, Americans move. There's just such a large body of us that even in small numbers, if we move abroad, we tend to have a really big impact on the places that we move to. This is absolutely true. So it is something that we should be conscious of. And we hear about a lot of countries that are very upset about the amount of tourists. They're not necessarily upset that they're American or any other group. They're just concerned with the total volume of people moving in and disrupting how things work in their country. And great examples of this is what we might think of as a national level gentrification, perhaps, but I think that's a bad way to view it. But we do see things like Airbnbs becoming saturated, rents becoming difficult to find, unaffordable in many cases. We see that the cost of living and just the quality of life for the people who are from these countries often suffers. But there's a few things, and we've talked about this in some other videos, that we need to think about. And I want to get to the really important point in just a minute. But first, any country that has this going on, that country has mechanisms and tools to curtail this should they, at a national level, believe this to be true. This is important to understand because in many cases, you get a group of people who are outspoken, who are anti-immigration, who are anti-tourism. It comes in a couple different forms, and we don't want to necessarily have this be perceived as a dislike of outsiders. It could be a group that loves outsiders. Maybe it's a group that traditionally has been so pro-outsiders that they've kind of drawn in more people than they really intended to or than they expected would ever happen, or never thought about what this could lead to in the long run. In any case, they now have a huge number, percentage-wise at least, of tourists or expats or immigrants that have come to their country. Now, when you get this outspoken group, it's easy to listen to them and not realize that they are potentially a minority. And you hear that they want people to go away, they want people to go home, they don't want this tourism to come in. But if you go take a vote, which is generally how most of these countries work, the populace votes for or away, generally for large categories of decision making, not real specific things like this, but they're generally democratic countries, and they're voting for a government that makes decisions about the good of the country and how tourism and immigrants affect that, and they're trying to make good decisions for the country based on that. And so if we take a country that is famously overpopulated with tourists, right, such as Spain, France, Italy, or Costa Rica, and we go to their governments and say, okay, does that government agree with this assessment? And in most cases, what we see now in Spain, France, and Italy, what we see is generally they do agree. They are doing a lot to make immigration relatively difficult. Not impossible. They're not saying that people who really need to immigrate don't have that option, but they're making it that it is not something casual. You don't just show up and suddenly get to live in the country. You don't get to just do nothing. You got to put in some effort. You got to really want to do it. You got to be very intentional. And generally, if it's really a goal, you can make it happen. But if you're going to Costa Rica, it's actually relatively easy to become an immigrant in Costa Rica if that's truly your goal. For most anyone, you're not going to just fall into it, but with very little intentionality, you can probably become an immigrant in Costa Rica. You can definitely become an expat or a tourist in any of these. In Costa Rica, they give really wide latitude to tourists, whereas in the other European countries that I mentioned, they tend to only give 90 days, no extensions, and that's all you get. So they really are doing a lot to at least limit long-term tourists, even though they're not limiting the number of short-term tourists in much of any way. Although some new constraints have come, we expect them to have very little impact on actual numbers, but a little bit for sure. But in Costa Rica, they're really making an effort to still attract immigrants and expats in large numbers. They're actually pushing towards this. So what this tells us in these cases is that those European countries that I mentioned and many others are tuning slightly. They've always tuned a bit away from immigration and slightly away from tourism, and now they're just the tiniest bit moving away from tourism as well, maybe looking to drop 1% to 2%, maybe 5% at the absolute most, just to reduce the number of people coming in or that are projected to come in, because they may be projecting a growth, and so they're trying to slow the growth rather than actually shrink the total number. In Costa Rica, what we're seeing is very much the opposite. It is crystal clear beyond a shadow of a doubt that the government is still pursuing attracting more and more. That whatever number we see as oversaturated in Costa Rica is officially seen as undersaturated. Maybe they feel they have a pretty good number, but they still want more. And so that is the way that their tax code, their immigration code, and other laws are written. They're designing those pieces of the infrastructure to try to bring in still more people. Now, some of their populace is very unlikely to agree with that, but it would be logical to assume that the majority of the population agrees with it. Now, in a case like this, where tourism is the primary or a primary financial factor of the economy of a country like Costa Rica, which is very, very tourist-driven, then having these numbers probably impacts a lot of people in a positive way. People who work as waiters, as construction workers, as cleaners, as hotel managers, as tourism investors, tour guides, resort operators, and so forth, which are large categories of workers, they probably see this as a benefit because their salaries go up and the chances that they're going to be unemployed goes down. So large swaths of the population has a direct impact by this because they're in that one of those economic groups. And others often see it as general growth for the country. If you were to take away the tourism, well, you would have all these people who are unemployed, and then they'd be a drain on other systems. So even if you work as an engineer and have absolutely no connection to tourism whatsoever, you may still be very positive towards anything that creates overall national economic growth. And I'm not saying that economic growth is the best thing ever and that it should be driving all decisions in a nation, but the economy is, in many cases, not as much as in the United States, but in most places, is considered pretty important, and people do look at it as an indicator of whether they're happy with the way that the country is going. And so if we look at places that we traditionally are very concerned about adding to an over-tourism number, it's very much our opinion that they are over touristed, over expatted, or whatever, and those countries often don't agree. There are certainly countries that have too many and are taking legal and political steps to slow that number, reduce that number, or whatever that is appropriate for them. But it's really important that we understand that our opinion, or hearing some people complain about the number of tourists, number of expats, does not indicate that that is an official stance from the country, nor a stance of the majority. But it does tend to be a very vocal group, as is normally the case. So it's important to consider it, but generally also take those complaints with a grain of salt, because they may be people who are simply out to damage their country, and that's a very easy way to do so. Now, in a really large economy like the United States, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. But you can imagine if you were to move to, or not even move to, simply hold a grudge against, name a small country anywhere in the world, and you wanted to do some economic damage, well, and you don't want to exactly go out and do something that could perjure yourself, then you could do something like make a YouTube channel and make lots of wild claims that the country is being damaged by tourists coming in, and you appeal to the ethics of potential expats and convince them to look away from that country, to not bother investigating it. You could potentially do a lot of financial damage, a lot of economic damage to a country without being in a position where you could ever be called out on it, or where you could ever be held accountable for the damage that you're doing. So it's a very soft means of potentially acting as a sort of economic terrorist against the country. So it's something that you really want to be aware that a lot of people just have an axe to grind. A lot of people just don't like immigrants. A lot of people work in a sector and don't want to see other people being employed. A lot of people have a lot of negatives that they may be bringing to the table that would encourage them to do that. Certainly, we don't want to assume that that is always the case. There are absolutely places that have too many tourists, but in general, as long as it's easy to travel there, then chances are the majority of the people and the government themselves have analyzed the situation and want to make it easy for you for a reason. So the more you feel welcomed by the process, chances are the more a country believes it would be good to bring you in. Now, for my last and the major point that I wanted to make today, and that is that let's assume that a country like Costa Rica or Italy actually are over-touristed, and they do have a majority of the population who do believe that they're being negatively impacted by the numbers that they are seeing. The government has decided to agree with them. They are now trying to curtail things, and they're hoping that you don't keep trying to go. Let's assume that some of those countries do exist. We certainly don't want to put it into the mouths of any country or peoples, but just hypothesize with me. We know that some of these countries do exist around the world. That is a given. The idea of over-tourism is certainly a real one. We're not making it up. People aren't just pulling this out of their, rear ends. This is a real problem. It's just not as big as people like to claim, because people often like a place to be very cheap, and they see their personal benefits from others not knowing about it, or they perceive there are negatives rather than understanding which positives of the place that they're living in or moving to come from that tourism or expats or whatever. Or some people just dislike change, and I understand. But when it comes to the end of the day, what we can hypothesize is there are certain countries that are experiencing this. But just because some countries are, one, it's not all countries, and two, it's definitely a minority. We'll ignore the minority part, but I can assure you that is true. But as far as whether it is all countries, it is certainly not. All those fears that there are places that are potentially gentrifying, those places that are having the Airbnbs go up in price, those places that are, having problems, that there's so many expats that they're disrupting society and things like that. While that is definitely true in some cases, the majority of the world, it is not true. Most countries would love to see, and I mean at all levels of society, would love to see more expats, more immigrants, more tourists come into their country, because it's simply a way to help the country's economy. It's a way to interact with foreigners. It's a way to get more resources. It's a way to get more information about the outside world. So many positive things come from having tourists. And if you've never been to a country that has very, very few, it's sometimes hard to understand how impactful it is, the lack of foreign interaction within a country, especially a poor country where the populace has a difficult time financially going abroad themselves. So in some countries where you have lots of wealth or lots of very easy movement, you may go out and explore the world as your own populace and bring that information back home. But in many countries, they depend on people from other places who have wealth or affluence or mobility to come to their country and bring culture and interaction and such information into them. And what ideally you want this to happen in both directions. So many countries, and I'm going to give a very concrete example. We generally assume here in Central America, and I'm going to list the Central American countries, right? We're going to ignore Panama. They're technically South America. And if you don't believe me, Reuters lists them as South America, even if you don't believe the Grand Columbia designation of South America traditionally, or the Panama Canal separation point between Central and South America. Panama is never officially considered part of Central America. The term in the region is Central America and Panama. We're not going to go into that. Okay, so the Central American countries are Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize. In that region, we generally assume that Costa Rica is over-touristed, although Costa Rica themselves do not support this at their government level. Belize has many times the immigrants of Costa Rica, and so we also assume that it is over-touristed, over-immigranted, if that is a term. Those two are generally used as the examples of what over-tourist or too many immigrants looks like. So I'm really hesitant on how I want to say this. It's important to understand neither of those countries have their governments taking a real action to curtail tourism or immigration. So both of them at an official level do not agree with that assessment. But if we were to push that assessment on them, we would still be left with those being the two smallest by population and almost the smallest by land countries within the region, being the ones that have too many tourists, too many expats for their populations. The other four countries of Central America, that's Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, represent the majority of the land area of this region by far. Each one of them, except for El Salvador, being larger than the other two countries. Only El Salvador is smaller than Costa Rica, but still larger than Belize. And all of them have larger populations, with Guatemala being nearly as large as the other three combined, but all four of them being larger than Costa Rica by more than 1 million people, and Belize being under 500,000, around 350,000 people. Even Belize and Costa Rica combined are not as large as the smallest of one of the other countries. So when we're looking at this, when we're looking at from a population perspective, we may be looking at maybe 10 to 15%, possibly quite a bit less, of the population of all of Central America lives in a situation where over-tourism is a potential risk, and 80 to 85%, maybe a little bit higher, of the population lives in an area where under-tourism is the current, or under-expats, expattery, however you want to look at that, is a current problem, that they are perceived as not having enough as would benefit them, and they are actively seeking and trying to acquire more, trying to attract more. So from a population perspective, it's really important to understand that even in this region that we perceive as being one of the worst for over-tourism in the Western Hemisphere, it's dramatically not the case. And if you go by landmass, which is not an appropriate way to do this, it's relatively similar numbers. Probably 80 to 85% of the landmass is in a situation where you don't have over-tourism. And the reality is, if you go to Costa Rica, you have loads of Costa Rica that is not over-touristed. It's simply that the economic impacts of the areas that are does hit most of the country as far as food supply, cost of rentals, and so forth. Belize is kind of its own animal. It's such a small country in population and landmass. However, you fly over Belize and there are loads of wide open areas that are not impacted by tourism in any meaningful way. However, the cost of land is on the high side, so in some ways it is impacted. But this is a really important concept, that just because we hear about some places having too much tourism, just like in Colombia, Medellin, too much tourism. The people in that city are constantly reporting that it is a problem. It is causing Airbnb costs to go up and all those things we talked about. But that doesn't mean that the same thing is applying to Bogota. That's not applying to Cali. It's not applying to Bucaramanga, to Cartagena, and other cities. Now, maybe some of them are experiencing some amount of that, but by and large, the country is not. It is a very large country, has loads of capacity to absorb expats if we just spread them out around the country in a little bit more appropriate way. Now, having hotspots where everyone goes to one place and not to others, can that cause problems? It absolutely can, and so that is something to be aware of. But when we're looking at this big picture and people keep reporting, oh, if American tourists keep going places, if American expats keep going places, it's going to ruin everything. It's going to do. It would take the entire population of the United States moving abroad before it really caused that problem everywhere. The world is able to absorb quite a few people as long as we don't isolate them to a few tiny countries. And that's important to understand. Costa Rica and Belize are tiny countries, and still they're not reporting that they are over tourist completely. And the bigger countries, the Brazils, the Argentinas, the Colombias, the Venezuelas, the Perus, even the Guatemalas, and even the Nicaraguas are constantly begging for more people. They would love to take on more people. They're not at a point where Airbnb prices are going up. They're not at a point where rent prices are going up. They're still at a point where they have unemployment problems. They're still at a point where they hope to raise minimum income levels. They're still at a point where they have empty real estate that they would love to get somebody into, because empty real estate hurts a country and used, actively functional real estate helps a country. They want to do those things. They have opportunities. And as long as we're going to the right places, it's not that emigration from the United States is a problem. It's that so many Americans pick, and it applies to everyone, right? So many Chinese pick certain places. So many Canadians pick certain places. So these hot spots, yes, we risk having hot spots that are going to be over expatted. Absolutely. But they are extremely pinpointed. They're extremely isolated and niche. That is not the norm, even in Central America, even in Mexico. Mexico as a country has loads of open space. If you look at our recent show that we did about the ratios of expats within different countries, all throughout this region, all the major countries have less than one person per less than 1% of the total population is expats. Like we're looking in this region like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. I think Mexico was 0.8. They're all in there. These are pretty low numbers. The places that have major concerns are more like 10 to 20%, right? And those places are still not completely shown to be a problem as far as the number of expats. So I'm not saying that we all want to get up to 10%, but as long as we're not at 1%, we're generally in a position where no one really notices. You may, again, have a hotspot within the country. If you're in Mexico, they've got places like Cancun that are extremely full of expats, but they also built that place to be full of expats, which actually means there are millions of people living in Mexico that are all in what is essentially an enclave. Plus, there's places like Merida that just have loads and loads of expats. And yes, that has caused a lot of damage in Merida from a cultural perspective, from a lifestyle perspective, from a cost of living perspective. But because those places are so full, that means the rest of Mexico is actually quite empty. The amount that Mexico could still take additional people is really extreme. Everyone in the region is pretty much in the same boat. So don't look at it from that perspective in the way that people panic that we don't want to do this damage. No, no, no. There is so much good, so much help that we can provide by going to the right places. Absolutely take into account which places don't really benefit from additional expats and which ones will benefit a lot. That is a great way to think about it. But don't do a blanket thing. Oh, this one tiny country may not need additional expats, so I'm going to not become an expat in all these other places. That is a terrible reaction to hearing about that one place. Just, okay, maybe that place I don't want to look at. I'll look at all these others. There's so much opportunity. Something like 95 to 99% of the total population of Latin America lives in a place that is under touristed and under expatted. You just don't go to that 1% of places, and you will be doing a great amount of good instead of a tiny bit of potential maybe harm. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. We have a join button that you can join our community. And it doesn't really do anything. It just helps you donate $5 each month to help keep the channel going in a predictable way. It helps us pay our bills and such. It is quite expensive to do the show. We have lots of information in our show notes. If you want to join our WhatsApp expat community for Nicaragua, with includes subgroups for different cities and all kinds of stuff, make sure you mute it or you'll go insane. If you want to send me an email, information's down there. If you want to send in a video question, we love getting those informations in there. And of course, get down those show notes, say hi, ask your questions, leave your comments, and I will see all of you tomorrow.